Imagine yourself in a small flat in Óbuda, on the outskirts of Budapest, on a clear Saturday morning in 1976. Outside the window, beyond rows of identical concrete blocks, your father is polishing a small, pale blue car with a chamois cloth. It has taken him 8 years on a waiting list to own it. The car is barely 3.5 meters long. Its body is not steel, but a strange composite of cotton fiber and resin. Its engine, only 594 cubic centimeters, runs on a mixture of petrol and two-stroke oil that must be measured by hand at the pump. When it starts, it sounds like a sewing machine attempting an area. This is the Trabant, and for nearly 4 million families behind the Iron Curtain, it was not a joke. It was the closest thing they had to freedom of movement. To understand the Trabant, you must begin where it was made, in the city of Zwickau, in the southeast corner of what had become, in 1949, the German Democratic Republic. The factory itself had once belonged to Audi and Horch, names which in another Germany had built some of the most refined automobiles in Europe. After the war, those names went west. What remained in Zwickau was a workforce, a set of tooling, and an order from the new socialist state. Build a car for the working family. On the 7th of November 1957, the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, the first Trabant P50 rolled off the line at the Zwickau plant, then still operating under its post-war name of VEB Automobilwerk Audi. 6 months before, it was merged into the new VEB Sachsenring Automobilwerke. Its name, Trabant, meant companion or satellite in German, a nod to Sputnik, launched only a month before. It was small, it was light, and the body panels were made of something the West had never quite seen on a passenger car. The material was called Duroplast, a sandwich of cotton fiber matting saturated in phenolic resin, hot-pressed in heavy steel molds at around 200 degrees Celsius. The cycle, heat to cool, took several minutes per panel. The result was a body panel lighter than steel, immune to rust, and almost impossible to repair if it cracked. Western journalists called it cardboard. In fact, it was a cotton and resin composite. But the joke stuck, and in Hungarian, the Trabant earned its own gentle insult, papírauto, the paper car. In 1958, a new chief designer arrived at Zwickau. His name was Werner Lang. He had been born in Bermsgrün, Saxony, in 1922. In 1944, serving in the Wehrmacht in Italy, he had deserted and joined the partisans. The state that would later award him the National Prize of East Germany in 1954 and again in 1974 never quite mentioned that history out loud. By the summer of 1964, Lang's team had brought the Trabant 601 into full series production, a slightly larger, slightly more refined version of the original. It would be built, with almost no significant changes, for the next 26 years. 2,818,547 of them in total. The most numerous private car in East German history. In Hungary, you could not simply walk into a showroom and buy a car. There was one legal seller of private motor vehicles in the entire country, a state-owned enterprise called Merkur, founded in 1964. Between then and its dissolution in 1993, Merkur would sell more than 2.2 million cars. Its delivery yard was at Csepel Szabadka Koto, the free port on Csepel Island in the southern Danube, where thousands of new Trabants arrived each year from Zwickau. To get one, you joined a list, you paid a deposit, then you waited. In East Germany itself, the wait was typically 13 to 16 years, outside the major cities, up to 18. In Hungary, by the mid-1980s, the wait was, by then, measured in months rather than years for a Trabant, set against 5 or 6 years for a Lada. Prices, in East German marks, ranged across the model line from around 8,500 for a basic 601 to over 12,000 for the better trimmed estates. By 1989, an entry-level Trabant cost approximately 12,000 marks. That was roughly 15 months of an average East German wage, paid up front. In Hungary, in October 1981, the distributor, that same Merkur, raised the required prepayment from 20% to 50% of the purchase price. To join the waiting list, you now had to surrender, in advance, half the cost of a car you might not see for years. And so the second-hand market thrived. A used Trabant, sold privately, regularly fetched more than twice the official price of a new one. You did not buy a Trabant to save money. You bought one because it might be the only car you would ever own. What did you do with it? You went to the Balaton. You drove to your in-laws in the next village. You took the children on Sunday afternoons to Margitsyget. You parked it outside the ABC Aruhas, the small, self-service grocery, at the foot of your La Caudelep, the concrete panel block estate. And on Saturday mornings, you washed it. You also often personalized it. Maxime Leo, in his memoir of an East German family, recalls that his father painted bright black and yellow circles on the wings of their gray Trabant, so that, he said, people could see them coming from a long way off. The neighbors, having no other explanation, assumed the car must belong to someone blind. It is the kind of small private joke that the everyday absurdity of socialist motoring seemed almost to invite. But behind the people's car lay a stranger story. On the 30th of December 1966, the East German state had commissioned a successor. The project was called the P603. It was to be a modern, comfortable four-stroke family saloon, designed by Werner Lang's team in Zwickau, with mass production planned for the end of 1969. By the end of 1968, 5.45 million marks had been invested. 9 prototypes had been built. Then the Politburo's economic chief, a man named Günther Mittag, canceled the project. Not paused, canceled. Most of the prototypes were destroyed. Drawings, tooling, and molds were broken up. Though in true East German fashion, at least 1 or 2 cars escaped the scrappers and survived in private hands. From January 1970, the Socialist Bloc began drafting a joint project, RGW Auto, to replace the Trabant, Wartburg, Skoda, and Dacia with a single shared car. It was meant to begin production in 1978. By April 1973, the Politburo had quietly shelved it as not ready for decision. East Germany would not get a modern car. It would get more Trabant 601s for another 17 years. The cost of that decision is hard to put a figure on. By the late 1980s, the Trabant's 2-stroke engine produced approximately 9 times the hydrocarbons and 5 times the carbon monoxide of an average European passenger car of the mid-2000s. In every East German town, on warm summer evenings, a blue-gray haze hung at street height. People joked that the Trabant was the only car you could smell before you saw. And the wait grew worse. By 1989, peak production reached 150,000 units a year. The official demand-to-supply ratio was 43-1. In isolated cases during the economic crisis of that year, individuals reported waits of 40 years. Many would not live to drive the car they had paid for. And then, that summer, the cars began to be abandoned. In August 1989, thousands of East Germans drove south through Czechoslovakia to the West German embassy in Prague, the Lobkowicz Palace. They climbed the fence, they claimed asylum, and they left their Trabants, locked, abandoned, paid for over a decade of saving, in the streets around the embassy. The Czechoslovak authorities, in the weeks that followed, would remove thousands of them. On the 19th of August, at a wooden gate at Sopron-Puszta, on the Hungarian-Austrian border, a Hungarian border guard called Lieutenant Colonel Arpad Bella was in command. The occasion was an event called the Pan-European Picnic, patronized by Imre Pazgai, the reform-minded Hungarian minister, and by Otto von Habsburg, last heir to a vanished empire. The gate was to be opened symbolically for 3 hours. 661 East Germans, many of whom had driven Trabants from their homes and left them on the Hungarian side, walked through that gate, past Bella's unarmed guards, and into Austria. Bella, on his own authority, chose not to fire, chose not to arrest. The Iron Curtain was breached in essence at a holiday cookout. On the 30th of September, from the balcony of the Prague embassy, Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher told the roughly 4,000 East Germans massed in the courtyard below that they would be allowed to leave for the West. He did not finish his sentence. The cheer drowned him out. By the end of the night, more than 6,000 had been put aboard the Freedom trains to Bavaria. On the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The footage that ran on Western television was not mostly of the crowds at the Brandenburg Gate. It was of small, smoking two-stroke cars, Trabants, streaming, hour after hour, through the checkpoints into West Berlin. Near Leipzig, a long convoy of them filled the Autobahn. The car of the captive state had, in a few hours, become the car of escape. In 1990, an artist called Birgit Kinder, born in a small Thuringian village and lately of East Berlin, painted on a surviving section of the wall a Trabant smashing through the concrete. She called the work Test the Best. 19 years later, in protest at the city's handling of the gallery, she would rename it Test the Rest. The Trabant in her painting, either way, never quite stops moving. In May 1990, production began on a final variant, the Trabant 1.1, fitted with a licensed Volkswagen engine. It lasted 11 months. On the 30th of April, 1991, the last Trabant left the Mosel plant. 39,474 1.1s had been built. In 1992, the factory was sold to Volkswagen. By the mid-1990s, unemployment in Zwickau approached 20%. In its first years, the new Volkswagen Mosel plant employed only a few hundred workers, growing to around 7,000 by the late 1990s. Even at that, it was barely two-thirds the size of the Trabant-era Sachsenring workforce of 11,500. Werner Lang, the deserter from the Wehrmacht who had become the father of the Trabant 601, died of a heart attack at his home in Zwickau on the 17th of June, 2013. He was 91. He had outlived the country whose people's car he had designed by very nearly a quarter of a century. And there is, in the records of Haggerty Media, the story of one East German who had joined the waiting list in 1976. He took delivery of his Trabant in the autumn of 1990. 14 years. On a list for a car from a country that, by the time the keys were in his hand, no longer technically existed. Behind this small car of cotton and resin lay something larger than transport. It was a queue, a savings book, a Saturday morning ritual. It was a balcony speech in Prague and a wooden gate at Sopronpusta. It was the patience of millions of ordinary families, and in the end, the slow exhaustion of that patience. If these small stories of life behind the Iron Curtain mean something to you, do consider subscribing. There is more to come. Until then, drive carefully.